So welcome back to Afri-CAN. Today we're going to look at an important aspect of fundamental innovation, which is innovation in the way that we do philanthropy itself. In order to discuss this, we first need to draw a mental map of the existing approaches to philanthropy. So I thought it might be useful to go through the concrete example of Faro Foundation's approach to philanthropy as a starting point to discuss the full spectrum of models that exist out there. So I would describe Faro Foundation as a hybrid model of what has been called philanthrocapitalism and moonshot philanthropy. Philanthrocapitalism is a way of doing philanthropy which mirrors the way that business is done in the for-profit world. We are driven at Faro Foundation by a private sector style of efficiency and a focus on evidence and results, both of which drive our organizational performance. Overall, we believe that our private sector experience can accelerate development. In terms of moonshot philanthropy, 2 years ago, we decided to organize our economic development projects around three missions, which are long-term moonshots in education, water, and productivity. We empower the next generation through access to high quality and affordable education. We solve East Africa's water scarcity problem by providing access to a safe and affordable source of water. And we remove structural, health, and financial obstacles to productivity and employment. Also, through our Faro Ventures social enterprises, we invest in high risk, early stage businesses, which is also characteristic of moonshot philanthropy. Finally, I would add that the way that we implement our philanthropic model is through direct delivery. We self finance, design, build, and operate our own network of development infrastructure assets like dams, schools, vocational training centers, and diagnostic centers. So, by definition, we are very hands on. We have more than 700 staff, and only 8 of us are in London. But the Faro Foundation example is just one case. So, to guide us through the maze of philanthropy models, I have invited Steph Hayden, Dr. Steph Hayden, who is a researcher at the University of Kent. She is currently working on the Moonshot Philanthropy project, exploring large scale, ambitious efforts to address complex social issues through philanthropy. And she's broadly interested in the intersections between philanthropy and the state, and how philanthropy can create or address structural inequalities. She is joined by David Nash, who combines his work at Effective Altruism UK with nearly a decade of philanthropy experience and advisory roles at several impact-focused organizations. So, without further ado, my first question is to Steph. I have outlined this Faro model as a blend of philanthrocapitalism and moonshot philanthropy. And so, for the sake of clarity, could you please go through the major categories within the philanthropy universe and what they entail?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually the Faro model is a really good illustration of already like two of the major kind of different philanthropy models, and also the fact that they can be combined. These are not necessarily discrete. There are dozens upon dozens of different labels used today to describe philanthropy approaches. But I think really, if you look at kind of the shared characteristics, these can be distilled down into just sort of three major trends. The first of them is ideas like moonshot philanthropy. These approaches use labels like ambitious philanthropy, audacious, big bets, best bets. It's all about trying to find and support innovative solutions to some of life's most complex challenges. Things like not just how do we help people experiencing homelessness, but how do we eradicate and then prevent future homelessness entirely. It's around kind of developing cures for particular diseases, or completely bringing a halt to and addressing the already negative impacts of climate change. These are huge issues, and philanthropy in this space is trying to take risks that other stakeholders can't or won't, and that's kind of the defining feature of that cluster or trend of philanthropy at the moment. The second then is kind of broadly market-based philanthropy. So exactly as you were talking about before with Pharaoh, this focus on evidence and results. It's the idea that philanthropy can and should learn from business and for-profit markets in order to increase the cost effectiveness of results achieved, and then using metrics in order to ensure that the result is achieved, to learn from that, and to improve the efficiency wherever possible. We often see market-based philanthropists trying to not necessarily wholeheartedly control, but at least in some way kind of influence or shape the organizations that they support in order to make sure their resources are being used as effectively as possible. And that could include, for example, attaching certain terms and conditions to the resources that are provided. And then the last trend is really kind of a direct counter to those market-based approaches and ideas, and that's social justice philanthropy. So these are based on a completely different worldview. They're based on this argument of saying, well, actually, business is completely inappropriate to apply to philanthropy, because if you bring in those ideas and those models, you're just going to recreate the same inequalities, the same issues that business and capitalism in particular created in the first place. So we've seen, especially kind of since the COVID-19 pandemic and since the racial justice protests of 2020, a huge rise in rhetoric around philanthropy for justice, around decolonizing philanthropy. And these efforts are focused on empowering communities instead of donors. So we've seen with it the rise of things like unrestricted giving as part of these kind of trust-based giving approaches, where donors aren't attaching strict terms and conditions to the resources they provide, but instead telling organizations, no, you can use these resources however you want because you are the experts in this area. So really quite different to the market-based model. But importantly, you can really sort of think about these three themes as a Venn diagram. The boundaries between them are sometimes a bit blurred, exactly as the Pharaoh Foundation, as you explained earlier. These can kind of be used in tandem together, and that in itself can create a whole host of kind of interesting results, but also some challenges along the way.
Wow, that is a very impressive display of the different options. Very efficient, Steph. Thank
Thanks.
you so much. Thank you. So my second question is to both of you. So what is the greatest innovation in philanthropy in the last 10 years? Or, has there been any at all? Maybe we start with Steph and then David can come in on that.
Yeah, I think personally I would kind of problematize this label of innovations. Like, I think we can definitely point to new tools and technologies, as I'm sure David will be able to in a moment, that have been introduced, that have grown in popularity in the past few years. But I think that nearly always the case is that the underpinning ideas behind these can be traced back decades, if not centuries. So if you take kind of the language around social justice philanthropy, the language, yeah, that took off in the past sort of 5 to 10 years. But that type of philanthropy, the ethos, the values that underpin that, they played a significant role in the civil rights movement of the last century. If we think about moonshot philanthropy, well, you could argue it was a moonshot of Andrew Carnegie to build 2,500 libraries in 46 years, 100 years ago. Similar with market-based philanthropy, like the ideas of philanthropy and business have always been brought together in some way. If you look at social investment, for example, or ideas around impact investing, yes, maybe we have some specific technologies that have evolved as finance and as technologies have themselves evolved, that can help us to measure, evaluate the impact of specific programs. But again, the ideas behind this, the ideas, say, of avoiding certain sort of sinful stocks, or of targeting kind of the best performing or the most good organizations and initiatives, that dates back to the ideas of Islamic finance from literally thousands of years ago. So I think in the philanthropy field, we have a bit of a habit of trying to constantly reinvent the wheel and then claiming that we have, when maybe we've really just slightly changed the color of the tire.
Okay, what do you say to that, David?
I would agree. When I'm trying to think about the last 10 years, has there been any kind of new innovation that didn't exist before then? I can't think of anything, but maybe there's things that have become bigger over the last decade. One that comes to mind is direct cash transfers, both in terms of private philanthropy, so charities like Give Directly or um, IRC or UNICEF directing people to give more cash to emergencies, or government agencies themselves, like governments around the world doing more direct cash transfers. I feel like that's increased a lot, and people are starting to think that, or have evidence that these things make more of a difference than either conditional cash transfers or trying to fill a warehouse full of teddy bears when there's an emergency. And yeah, and then another part of that is also remittances has increased quite a lot, and now I think it's around, I don't know, over 800 billion per year, something around that. Maybe it could even be much larger. And foreign aid is maybe around 200 billion-ish a year. And so remittances is already much larger, and that's another kind of cash transfer. And I
Mm,
feel like in the last decade, those things have increased quite a lot, and people have started to think, okay, how do we use this as agencies, as governments? But then in terms of maybe specific innovations that already existed, but maybe have got a little bit bigger, is stuff like prize philanthropy, stuff like X Prize or the longitude prize for antimicrobial resistance. Then stuff like hit-based giving, which maybe is similar to another name is like Moonshot, thinking about how to fund lots of different things. And maybe even if one of those succeeds, like a new vaccine for malaria, that could be massively useful. And then another is advanced market commitments, like someone saying, or government or agency saying, we will definitely buy this thing if you make it. I think that has been used in vaccine development before as well. So there's different innovations that have already existed, but maybe they've been a bit more popular in the last decade.
very interesting. Okay. So yeah, kind of tagging on to this discussion, I guess I'd like David, maybe if you could zoom in on the particular approach of effective altruism, which, has been somewhat controversial, and tell us how effective altruism differs from other types of philanthropy, first of all, and second, do you think this is the ultimate approach to maximizing impact? And yeah, just discuss the general relation between effective altruism and impact, please.
So yeah, I guess I would see EA as more of a question rather than a specific method of you have to look at this type of metric and then do this thing. It's more kind of saying, how can I do more good without assuming a specific cause area or value system? And so, no matter what your value system is, effective altruism is just saying, ask yourself, how do I do more good in this area, and how do I do that? And that could be focusing on animals, stopping nuclear war, stopping pandemics, focusing on global development. There's lots of different things that could be, and because it can lead you to different areas, it also means it can lead you to different ways of thinking about impact. And so that could be very highly measurable evaluations of charities or programs. It could also be more expert opinion, qualitative methods, using reasoning and trying to work out what will happen if this thing happens. And I think within EA, there's generally a high openness to shifting methods if something doesn't seem to be working. And so I wouldn't say that the EA approach is like the best approach because it's not really one approach. There's some stuff that's more popular within EA, but those things can become less popular, or like someone else comes along and says, "This seems to work. Why don't you try it?" And then people will be like, "I will try that." And so I think it's less about having a rigid methodology and more about exposing yourself to more different toolkits to think about
Mm,
how to have impact, and also connecting you to a network of people who are thinking similarly. How do I find the best way of doing it is doing this thing that I want to do in terms of helping people or helping others. And then with maximizing, I think that can be very dangerous. Like if you just focus on optimizing for one specific metric, that can be, it can be
mm,
forgetting the things that can't be measured, and maybe you're focusing on just where the like that uh I guess story of like if you've lost your keys in the dark and you're just looking into the street light, but you lost them somewhere else. If the light is on the street area, then just because it's there doesn't mean you're going to find your keys there if that's not where you
yeah.
lost them. And so yeah, I think there's I don't know, a different way of seeing it in my mind as more of a question to help you work out how to do good rather than saying you have to do it this way and you have to maximize. That would be a mistake in my opinion.
Hmm. Very interesting. And it's about experimentation as well, I guess. Um, did you want to add anything to that, Steph, on effective altruism or?
I have more of a sort of question really, because I find it really interesting the fact that you were saying that there is this degree of flexibility in it, and that you're already acknowledging, like, if you're using measurements, particularly quantitative measurement, it can become a bit like the blind leading the blind, and you put the blinkers on and you forget everything else that's outside of that. And to me, like, my understanding is that measurement is kind of the defining characteristic of approaches like effective altruism. And so if actually that can be sort of more flexible, then how are you sort of still justifying the need to measure, um, and why you uphold that as so important given the inherent flaws? And B, if you don't always kind of prescribe how it needs to be measured, what do you see as kind of like the key defining trait of effective altruism then?
Yeah, so I guess with the first part, like I don't think it has to be measurement. Like there's some things that can't be measured. If you're trying to stop a pandemic, we have had some pandemics in the past, but we don't have enough to say you can run an RCT on pandemics on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's just some things that can't be measured, and you have to work out other ways to evaluate those. And even with the things that can be measured, there's lots of flaws. Like, does this RCT in Uganda also cross over to somewhere else 5 years later? Maybe not. And so there's lots of flaws with measurement. And I think within EA, there's an interest in like what are the things that we can measure, what we can look. But there's also massive disagreement amongst people in EA. It attracts a lot of people that disagree with each other, but are open to being wrong about that. And so they're always looking for new ways of working out how to have impact, whether that's like something that can be measured or the flaws in that measurement. And so that's where a lot of the debate happens, is like, how should we focus on these things? And that means there's lots of things that come out of EA in terms of focuses. And I'd say the core of EA isn't how do we quantify impact, but how do we do good? And then that will depend on the individual as to how much they weight the evidence. Like maybe they ascribe no value to well-being metrics, in which case then they look for something else. But some people do, and so it's more about like people in EA can supply like the evidence and the reasoning, and then people can just choose which bits they want to use for their own donations and their careers and their impact.
Excellent. So I guess a kind of consequence of everything you said is my next question, which is, you have this deep understanding of effective altruism. So conversely, how do you see the emergence of what Steph has described as unrestricted giving? And how problematic is it to measure impact in this kind of situation of unrestricted giving?
I think it seems like a good thing. It's good to have more experiments of what may or may not work. Maybe the value would be the foundations trying to measure the impact of who they've donated to, rather than asking the charities to have uh, high requirements for filling out responses, and say, actually, if we want this charity to do this thing in this area, maybe we go to that area and see whether there's been an impact for ourselves, rather than asking the charity to do that. And I think within EA, it depends on how you define no strings, because I think some of the larger funders tend to be relatively low strings. They're very trust based in terms of like they'll give funding to this organization for 2 years, and they don't require a lot of forms to be filled in, and they understand that there's a lot of bureaucracy in philanthropy. And so I've noticed most funders tend to be quite low compared to traditional funders. And yeah, I think it can overlap with EA quite well. And it's also good to see more people trying different things, because maybe they're correct and they do have more impact there. It'd be good to see that exist rather than not have that innovation.
Mm. Any thoughts on that, Steph?
I think it's quite interesting when you start bringing it into like unrestricted giving, because that's then kind of resources that are not necessarily tied to a specific program, and so it can be really like even more challenging to trace, say, the impact of the funds given on achievements that the organization made. And yeah, I mean, it's already pretty difficult if even if you take one specific project or program that an organization is running and you say, okay, this individual contributed £100,000 to that. Well, the wider project was £10 million. That's how much it cost to run that. So how can you kind of really total up the kind of quantify or just in some way capture the impact of that one specific contribution, especially if, you know, today's day and age when the financial contributions are not always just financial, they often come with input of time, advice, and so on. When you're then looking at that in an unrestricted giving setting, okay, then more likely to be just sort of saying, okay, I'm going to sign a check. You know what you're doing with it. But again, the idea of kind of tracing causality between resources provided and output achieved, I understand the logic of trying to measure and evaluate in some way what philanthropic organizations are doing, but it's also arguably impossible to actually have a perfect way of evaluating it. And so I then also likewise understand why some people then say, why should we bother? Why do we keep making kind of burdensome requirements for these organizations to do to fill out metric reports for us so that we can evaluate them? And why not just have a totally unrestricted view and say, we just, you know, we assume that they know what they're doing and we're happy with that.
Fascinating. Okay. So my final question to both of you is, I mean, you've partly responded to it along the way, but I think it's a good way to kind of wrap all of this up. Um, you know, should we strive for innovation in the philanthropy world? And if so, what should innovation entail? Maybe you can start, David.
Yeah, I think we should strive for innovation, although depending on how you define what that means. I think if we can improve outcomes and that is led by innovation, that makes sense rather than just innovating or trying lots of things because people want to try lots of things. That doesn't make sense to me. Whereas if it leads to better outcomes, but I guess it's hard to know until you've tried things. And I think there's probably some point where there's a trade-off between the amount you should innovate and the amount you should spend on executing ideas, even with
Absolutely.
government spending. Like there's fundamental research funding for universities and research labs, but then if you don't also pay pensions or for transport, that there's issues there. And so you need some kind of understanding of where that trade-off is. And I'd imagine at the moment the trade-off is maybe slightly more towards execution than it should be, and there's probably a lack of funding for research and innovation to some degree, but I don't know for sure. And I think it's really hard to push for innovation from the charity side. Like if you want more innovation to happen, that's probably going to have to come from the funders side because the charities will respond to incentives and the funders kind of set those incentives. And so you need different foundations, maybe the government to say what innovation they're looking for to kind of research that. And I think for some kind of examples of foundations that have done this, I'm thinking of Open Philanthropy again because they have done a few different things. They've done some hit-based giving where they funded stuff like malaria vaccines and trying to test different things to see what works and what doesn't work, and expecting most of them to fail. And if some of them succeed, that's pretty good. They also have less charity reporting requirements, and they have more transparency over who and what they're funding and why. And other foundations can go and look and see that. And they even, I think, ran a competition for people to feedback on what are we missing, and they were asking what areas might we want to look into that we don't know about, and anyone could write in and suggest an area for them to do that. And so, yeah, I feel like there's different ways to maybe those are like on the smaller side of innovation, but there's a variety of different ways to innovate, and I think that foundations are probably the ones that are going to have to push that forward if they want to see that. If you agree with the idea that there's a lack of innovation in the sector. But yeah, I would say yes, we should strive for innovation.
Great. Thank you, David. Steph?
So I would agree that I think we absolutely should always be striving to improve. And I think that can come through innovation, that can come through research and knowledge exchange and discussion and debate and disagreement. I think that's all really important to have and to pursue. But I don't think we should have innovation for the sake of innovation. And improvement doesn't have to come through innovation. And I think even if you kind of look at what it means to innovate, you don't have to innovate by doing something that's completely new in every single possible way. It could actually be by taking an old idea and doing something different to it. So it could be 90% the same, but you've just sort of tweaked that last 10%. And it's enough to go, this bit of it is innovative, and that could be enough to have quite a transformative impact. But I kind of say all that because again, it seems like every week we have a new way of describing philanthropy, or a new innovative way of practicing philanthropy, that when you actually look at it, you go, there isn't really very much new about this. And I think that implies actually a lack of kind of widespread knowledge and understanding of what's come before in philanthropy history. And I use history very broadly because sometimes it's history from like 5-10 years ago. And so what I think is actually more important is greater learning and understanding of what approaches have been attempted before, in what contexts, what made them work, what did they struggle with, why was that, how, if, should we adapt these to the present situation. And I think that kind of learning and adapting is more important and often more beneficial than just wholesale, quote unquote, innovation.
Is there an old idea that you have in mind that you think, oh, that's one that definitely should be getting more funding or be looked into more?
I think not necessarily. There's not one that just sort of like immediately shoots to mind, but I think that's probably because honestly, I think every kind of approach that's out there right now, that's a language that's used right now, is in some way based on what's come before. So I think in every one of those cases, the philanthropist would have benefited from going, okay, what came before, and acknowledging those trends and those practices and building on that, instead of branding this whole new label, this whole new term, and trying to stir up totally new, completely detached discussion on it. Because as I said before, I think that discussion, that ongoing learning, is really, really important. And if we're constantly just saying, no, this is brand spanking new, you detach it from that long-term learning and history.
Wow. Yeah, no, I love this idea, right? Because it's going back to the nature of the scientific process at the end of the day, right? It's about building on what came before. And yeah, we need to take a page out of that. Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much both for a great discussion. Now we finally know what we need to do in the philanthropy world that we're all involved in one way or another. So thank you so much. Um, and yeah, look forward to our next episode, which will be on the diaspora and innovation. So thanks again to both of you.